Hi all, welcome to my next session on writing better Scala. We were discussing about pushing our business logic to types, and we used zio-config to retrieve certain config from a particular source, and we discovered a few things such as configuration generation as providing examples to the users of your config library or your ETL framework. We also discussed about reading the application config. Obviously that was the first thing to discuss, and I hope that was clear enough. So just a quick recap. We have an application config with a data source and a region which is optional, and a data source itself is a ADT, and we used automatic descriptions, automatic derivation to create config descriptor, which is then used to read the config. In today's session, we will be discussing more on actual documentation. While we discussed about configuration generation, we need some sort of documentation for the users so that they know more about your config parameters, not just an example. We'll also cover pushing more business logic into types. And they're not really business logic in this session, but they are simple validations. We have a combinator called documentation in zio-config that will allow you to annotate your descriptor with certain business level documentations, a high level or ETL related framework, ETL framework related config. So for example, string of host, this is my host. Now this is important that if you give an extra piece of documentation, which is always preferable, this becomes available in your error reports. All right, now that's the way you do things in manual descriptor. So you can combine that with host, and you can combine that with port, and so on and so forth. We have already discussed about manual descriptor, but in this case, we are using automatic derivation. So how do we document things in automatic derivations? We don't have a combinator. We can't use a combinator because we are not defining a config descriptor manually anywhere. So in that case, you can use describe annotation in your case class. In this case, we are building a program that attaches the description, which means this description that you're going to provide, along with the actual config descriptor at compile time. So here we say host of the database, just to give an extra piece of information to the user is always nice. And this can be port if the source is a database. Anything that you like. I'm not quite worried about what exactly you give. It depends on the use case. Now if I go back and say I'm not giving host, I don't think we need to print the example config in this session. So we'll delete that. So here in this case, I intentionally deleted the host, and I should get an extra piece of information in the error message. You haven't given the host, and this is added with your extra piece of information, that host of the database if source is database. And if you're not handling that error, consider handling the other errors in that branch. You know how to parse this error message. We have discussed that as well. Cool. But what happens if users need a pre-built Markdown file that explains about all the config that they can refer to when they write the config? They've already got an example config that they can edit by using zio-config gen, but they also need an explanation about different config parameters that you're expecting. For that, you really need a Markdown file generation. So in zio-config, you can give generateDocs. Actually, there is a repetition going on here. So let's say application config from source is our config descriptor, and you can read the config, and you can then generate the config docs from that config. generateDocs is not an either, and hence you don't need a add or reverted. Instead, you can simply put is equal to in your for comprehension Anyway, that generateDocs is going to give you config docs, probably not quite useful. So you need to have a Markdown file. For that, first you convert that to a table. Why there is a table in between? Because you can convert this table to any format that you like. If you need an XML format or if you need a JSON, you can go ahead and write your own custom rendering of that table. Zio-config has already got one pre-built, which is to GitHub flavored Markdown. You can also use to Confluence Markdown. Probably let's print that up. We haven't given the host yet, so let's give the host host.com, and you can see this Markdown file. It's pretty, for those who are familiar with Markdown, it's pretty straightforward. Let's try and push this to GitHub and see how this is rendered. Commit some sample file. That's not the one. I think our config is this. It says these are the details of all the config parameters. It says handle all of these field descriptions, which is source and region. And when it comes to source, handle any one of source, meaning you can give either a database or a Kafka or S3 bucket. But if you're giving a database, you have to give all of database, which is host, password, username, port. You can see your extra piece of information is available in the documentation, host of the database, sources database. Kind of funny, but that's enough for the demo. Kafka, we haven't given any extra piece of information. S3 bucket, no extra piece of information. These are all auto-generated descriptions by zio-config. So going back to the process of pushing business logic into the types, I'm repeating that statement again and again because that's the most important part of the entire video series that I'm doing. How do I push things to the types as much as possible? Host being a string. What happens if it is an empty string? What happens if it is a port which is of the value 0? What is my username and password is also empty? I mean, these are basic validations. Now you can do a validation before you load this into config by using various techniques. If you're using manual derivations, you can do things like string of host and transform, which is a function that is available in zio-config, transform or fail, and then you convert that to if A is empty and so on and so forth. I haven't discussed transform or fail in any of the sessions. You can probably refer to that in the documentations. So let's not worry about that part yet. How about representing the fact that host shouldn't be empty? For that, you can use a library called refined. With refined, you can say my host is refined string non-empty. It's a string of the type non-empty. It's a port of the type, well, it could be, it's an int. Actually, there is a documentation about how to do all of this in zio-config itself, and that is under automatic validations. You can see all these examples. So refine will work with auto derivations, and refine will work with your manual derivations. All this information is there on the website. But for now, let's go ahead and copy paste some of these imports, which is going to be useful. So here you can see I can use this predicate, greater than something. So greater than, import that one. Is that available? How do I get W? That's a witness in refined. This implies my int should be greater than 2. Actually, let's use greater than or equal to maybe 1024. Very nice. So let's repeat that for username. String non-empty. Remember that all the predicates are available. Most of the predicates are available in refine, and you can create custom refined types as well. For those who are not familiar with refined, probably this is your starting point. So password, again, string, non-empty. Let's align that a bit. Yeah, you need an extra import, which is zio-config refined. I'll explain what is this extra import. Basically, this package knows about how to integrate these types with the auto derivation of zio-config. That's a conceptual explanation about it. For those who are familiar with type class instances and type class derivation, you would probably guess what's going on with that import. But anyway, that's required. So now it compiles. Let's go back to main and try and run the program. Well, that's the first thing, conversion error. It's unlike missing values. It says predicate 12 is less than 1024. It did not fail, meaning your port is less than 1024. It's a negated error message, and that's given by the refined library, which is then channeled through to zio-config and gives it back to you. Well, let's fix that. Actually, don't fix that. Let's give an empty string of host and see if it accumulates all of those errors. And it does. It says predicate is empty, did not fail, which means it is empty. And predicate 12 less than 1024 did not fail, which means it's less than 1024. Let's fix both of them. And your program ran successfully. Now remember that these are not automatic validations alone. This is also bringing about logical consistency into your application. Now the moment you use anything in that database, for example, if you want to print out the host, so I can confidently get the value out of it. Cool. And that's printed out, abc.com. Thank you all for watching this video, and always give me feedback and I'll try and improve. Thanks everyone. See ya.